Alrighty, today we're going to be talking about a new project that is being sponsored by Primary Challenge, and that project has to do with the dividing of New York State into two separate political entities. And the project is called our New Amsterdam Project. The goal of the project is to separate upstate New York from the downstate New York region. And as the slide indicates, there are 53 counties in upstate New York, and our goal is to separate all 53 counties from the remaining counties of downstate New York. The proposed map for New Amsterdam is actually borrowed from an organization called Divide New York, who is also trying to separate New York State into two separate entities. And that map indicates in the red that these are the counties that we want to separate from the state of New York, leaving the remaining 9 counties of downstate New York as New York State. There are reasons why the people of upstate New York want to secede from the state of New York. And I've referenced the Constitution of the United States. It says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among them the powers of the earth, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitles them, that a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And what that means is that we don't want to separate just because. There are very serious differences between upstate New York and downstate New York. There are very deeply held concerns and reasons why the people of upstate New York want to separate from downstate New York. The first of those reasons are not the most important, and these are not in any particular order, but one of those reasons is immigration. The state of New York is making the entire state, in particular the city of New York, a sanctuary state for illegal immigration to the state of New York. And because of that illegal immigration, the people of the state of New York, including the people of upstate New York, who in particular are opposed to this type of immigration and the sanctuary nature of this immigration, we're being forced to pay for all of these expenses that are a result of this immigration. The next one is taxation. We just recently passed a $175 billion tax bill onto the voters and residents of New York State. It is an unconscionable amount of money, and a huge amount of that money is used to pay interest on debt, to supply the expenses for illegal immigrants. There's waste in government. We've got projects that the governor has sponsored, such as the Buffalo Billion, which is nothing more than a financial sinkhole. And taxation is driving people out of the state of New York, a huge percentage. We are the #1 place from which people are leaving because of that one item, taxation. The Second Amendment, the state of New York has an animus against any and all forms of gun ownership. And they're doing everything they can to undermine your constitutional rights to hold and to have the ability to protect yourself, not just from a criminal or someone who might do you physical harm, but also to protect yourself from an oppressive government. That's what the Second Amendment is there for. And then the abortion issue, which for me is a very important issue. As a pastor, it's very near and dear to my heart. And just this past January, the governor, keeping his promise to expand abortion rights, had the legislature craft and pass legislation in a matter of 3 days to allow the abortion of children even to the moment of birth, and then to allow for a 2-hour time span where the child, if born during the course of an abortion, can be put to death after it is born. These are unconscionable things that the governor is doing, and the people in particular of upstate New York are simply not going to tolerate this type of barbarism. And then there are the moral issues. And again, we're talking about issues that are very near and dear to my heart as a pastor, but we have now transgenderism has become the new cause celeb. And so we now have people who simply want to feel like a woman going into men who feel like a woman going into ladies' bathrooms. We have schools that are teaching children that it is okay to be transgender. We have legislators who are passing legislation forcing schools to teach children that transgenderism and homosexuality and things of that nature are normal and acceptable, when in fact they are not. The history of secession from a state is not new. It's something that has happened in the past, as the slide indicates. Kentucky has separated from Virginia in 1792. Maine separated from Massachusetts in 1820. And West Virginia, in particular, because of the Civil War, separated from Virginia in 1863. The history of secession also includes another one that I thought was very special. In 1790, Vermont separated from New York, and there was a fee that was paid to the state of New York to allow the separation of Vermont to go through. But according to the University of California at Berkeley, and the two gentlemen who made this statement said this: although Vermont was admitted into the Union with New York's consent, it is not at all clear that New York's consent was constitutionally necessary. And therein lies the power of what we're going to do. See, all of these organizations that exist to try and bring about the separation of New York into two separate states have been going to the state to try and get permission to separate. And that's not the way it's done. Our forefathers actually tried that process. They continued to go to the king and ask for permission to separate from England, to become a separate political entity. And the king obviously didn't want that to happen and refused to allow it to happen. And so our forefathers were left with no other recourse but to secede by force. The legal basis for our secession, the legal basis for dividing New York into two states, or for our leaving the state of New York, is found in the Constitution. It is called the consent of the governed. And in order for government to exist, in order for it to have both moral and legal authority, it must have the consent of the governed. Any government that exists without the consent of the governed is a totalitarian government. It is dictatorial in its very core. The Declaration of Independence, which has been codified as law and is governing law in the United States, says this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator. I want you to notice that. It's not by the state. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, listen to this, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. You see, the law requires that the government have, maintain, and continue to maintain the consent of the governed in order to remain, in order to continue to have that moral and legal authority to govern. The Declaration continues. It says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. You see, they need our consent to continue governing. We don't need their consent to leave. And that's the difference between this and everything that's been tried for 30 years. We're not going to the altar that is governed by Andrew Cuomo and begging for the governor and the legislature of New York to let the slaves on the plantation go. We're going there with an ultimatum. You are going to let us go, and we have the political and the moral and the legal authority to leave. I want to give you some state constitutions. 48 of the 50 state constitutions currently, today, reaffirm the right of the people to alter and abolish their government. It also reaffirms the need for government to have the consent of the governed. The original Constitution of the state of New York was also had that requirement in it, but has subsequently been taken away. But the important item to remember is that the right to alter government and the right to abolish it is not given to us by the state. It was given to us by God. Arizona's Constitution, all political power is inherent in the people, and governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. You see, without the consent of the governed, the government has no moral or legal authority to exist. Georgia has a similar constitution. It says all government of right originates with the people, is founded upon their will only. And any government that's founded on anything other than the will of the people, any government that exists and functions without the will of the people, is dictatorial and totalitarian in nature. The Constitution of Georgia continues. It says government is instituted for the protection, security, and benefit of the people. And at all times, they have the right to alter or reform the same whenever the public good may require it. You see, we have the right to alter or abolish the political bonds that we have to a particular government, to our state government, and even to our local governments. We don't have to be slaves to the status quo. The history of the United States, as I mentioned before, was that the colonists became oppressed by the King of England and by the government that was sent here to govern the people of the colonies. And after years of entreaty, after years of going back and forth to England to beg the king for relief, the colonists came to the conclusion that they could no longer rightly serve the king. And they exercised the right to withdraw consent. And that's what the Revolutionary War was all about, is the consent of the governed. The king had lost it, and the people, recognizing that that right came to them from God, exercised that right, and out of that conflict came the United States of America. This is how the process works. They can't tell us that there is a need for the government to have the consent of the governed and then not tell us how that consent was obtained or how that consent can be taken away. So here's the process. We're going to engage volunteers to petition the local town boards because all political power begins with the people. It emanates from the people and is pushed up the political ladder. And when you want to withdraw the consent of the people, you don't start at the legislature in Albany or at Washington. You start with the people on Main Street. You start with your neighbors and your family and your friends. And so we're going to engage volunteers to petition the town board, the most local form of government that we have. And we're going to petition the town boards and the city councils to adopt a resolution of separation from New York State. And that's the first place that our decision is made. In every county, there are towns. And in New York State, in the 53 counties in particular that are going to secede from New York State, there are 1,120 towns that are represented by this state. And in all 1,120 towns, we will have volunteers who will be circulating a petition to their town boards or to their city councils to ask them to pass resolutions to separate from New York State. The resolution from the towns and cities, once they are obtained, will be forwarded to the county leadership of the 53 counties of upstate New York. The people have spoken at the lowest level of government to their town board members. The town boards have passed resolutions of secession, but those resolutions aren't yet binding. They have to pass it further up our political ladder to the county boards of supervisors or county legislatures, depending on the county that you live in. And when the counties pass the resolution as well, then the decisions are made to send those resolutions to the state of New York and to the federal government. When we have 3/4, or upon the formal passage of resolutions of separation by 3/4 of the counties, a Declaration of Independence shall be sent to New York State and the United States government, terminating the political relationship with New York. Now, to be very clear here, we are not attempting to create a separate state. That's a process that's governed by the United States Constitution in a second step that will be taken. What we are going to do is we're going to segregate the 53 counties of upstate New York from the other 9 counties of upstate New York and create a separate political entity called New Amsterdam. And once that political entity is formalized, once it has its own governing structure, that governing structure will apply for statehood to the United States government. And at that point, New Amsterdam, or whatever name the new legislature gives it, will be admitted into the United States as a state. And so it's a twofold process. It's a two-step process. It's not just we're going to create a new state. We don't have the constitutional authority to create another state. But we do have the constitutional authority to create another political entity. And then that political entity can apply for statehood to the United States government. We've chosen the 3/4 number as it is in the United States Constitution. If there is going to be an amendment to the Constitution, it's a requirement that 3/4 of the states pass that constitutional amendment. And so when we're going to change the political relationship between upstate New York and New York State, 3/4 of the counties of the upstate region will have to affirm that resolution to make that change. And once we reach that 3/4 threshold, which is 40 of the counties, 40 of the 53 counties, then we will have achieved our goal. During the process, and this is where things, I believe this process will take at least 3 years to accomplish. During this process, our legislators, there are going to be some who are not going to be in favor of separating from New York State for whatever reason, and I'm not going to say that any of them are disingenuous, but there are legislators who are simply not going to be supportive of this process. Well, that's where the primary challenge, original function, comes into play. During the next 2 years, before the next election for local and state legislators, we will be identifying all of those legislators who will not support separation from New York State. And through our town coordinators, our county coordinators, and our regional coordinators, we will identify candidates who will run against them in the primary of the party that they belong to. And as a result of that primary, we will hope to remove them from public office, and in the subsequent legislature, have them pass the resolution so we get the 40 counties that we need to successfully secede from the state of New York. Candidates willing to run for office with the platform of separation will be identified and supported by New Amsterdam and primary challenge. So not only are we going to find candidates, but we're going to put muscle behind those candidates. We're going to find our volunteers that are in the towns and in the counties, and we're going to have them going door to door and helping those candidates. We can't just throw a name on a ballot and expect that somehow that candidate's going to win. It takes effort. It takes work to win an election. And so we're going to find candidates to run, and then we're going to support them in that run when the time comes. Upon ratification by 3/4 of the counties, each county sheriff will be tasked with enforcing the people's decision via their county representative. And this is the question that a lot of people ask when I talk to them about this process is, how are you going to enforce this decision? You have counties that passed the resolution. You have 40 counties that have effectively said, we are separating from New York State. How do you enforce that decision by the counties? Well, the answer is with the county sheriff. The county sheriff will be responsible to perform that which is necessary to extricate the people of upstate New York from the government of the state of New York. And if that means that they have to go in and by force remove people from their offices and send them to wherever the state wants to set up its new headquarters, then that's what they'll have to do. And I don't believe that there will be resistance. I will say that. There will be resistance, but I do not believe it will be violent resistance, and I don't believe it will be a great deal of resistance, because I don't think Andrew Cuomo or any other legislator from downstate New York is going to want to get in a fight with the county sheriffs of 53 upstate counties. I don't think that's going to happen. This is the current reality we live with today by the enrollment statistics. And what I've tried to do is to not make this a Democrat versus Republican issue. I don't want it to be that. I want it to be a right versus wrong. But let's be honest, downstate New York liberal Democrats are what are controlling the state of New York today. And so for the sake of this process, I want you to see what the political realities would be if we were successful in making the change. We currently have a registration in the state of New York where 50.2% of the residents that are registered to vote are registered Democrat. And 22.6% of the people registered to vote are registered Republican. And so if we're going to hope that the change that we want to happen is going to happen at the state level, we are deluding ourselves. It's just not going to happen. We have a democratically controlled assembly. We have a democratically controlled Senate. We have a democratically controlled governor's office. We have a democratically controlled attorney general. These changes that we want are never going to happen with the disadvantage of registration as it exists today. If we are successful, this is what the registration would look like if it were today. 36.8% of upstate New York would be registered Democrat. 32.2% would be Republican. That's a problem. We still have a registration disadvantage of roughly 4 percentage points. But that's not really a problem, because 31% of the registered voters are either conservative, independence party, or blank. And they lean to the conservative side of the political aisle. And so I don't believe that just because the 4 percentage points exists in the favor of the Democrats that we would have a democratically controlled legislature, assembly, and governor's office and attorney general. I don't believe that would happen. And there are other things that could happen if it were true, but it's not true. There are some pretty basic advantages to splitting off and creating this separate political entity and ultimately becoming another state, 51st state. The first one would be the Electoral College application. At present, New York State law says that if an individual wins the presidential election in New York, that person, even if he wins by 1 vote, gets all of New York's electoral votes. There are 27 electoral votes in New York right now, and upstate New York represents roughly 1/3 of those electoral votes. 9 electoral votes, if my math serves me well, 9 electoral votes would be transferred to the new entity, and whoever wins that entity's vote during the presidential election, that candidate would receive the electoral votes of upstate New York. That's a huge change in the federal representation that we would have. It could make the difference between, or could be the difference between having one party or another win an election. The second thing is in our U.S. Senate. This is also a very big issue because if we are successful in creating a separate political entity and we go through the process of becoming a state, that state would be given 2 U.S. senators. And if the people choose, both of those U.S. senators could be conservative in nature, Republican by affiliation, if that were the case. And it would change the nature of the U.S. Senate, which could be a very big deal. We would have a greater influence in federal appointments, in particular in appointments to the United States Supreme Court. And so you see these issues, this process has more to do with, or has as much to do with things that happen at the federal level as things that happen right here on Main Street. It's a very important process. In fact, I've mentioned it to several people that this is a historic event. It's a historic event. And then we could, as a people, as upstate New York, we could have a constitution that reflects the values of the people of upstate New York, of New Amsterdam, if that's what we choose to call it. The Constitution of the state of New York simply does not reflect the values of the people of this end of the state of New York. And so we could craft for ourselves a constitution that was consistent with our sincerely held beliefs. So there's a lot of reasons to support this segregation of, or separation from, New York State. This has been the primary challenge model since 2005. When I started it, it was written by my favorite author, God. It says, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. I'm here to tell you that the wicked are in control of our state, and it's time for us to do something about it. I hope you'll join me in separating upstate New York from the remainder of New York State. How can I help? Volunteer to be a town representative. There are 1,120 towns, and we are going to be actively looking for leadership in each of those towns to help submit the petitions to the town boards and allow those town boards to pass the resolution of separation. Host public meetings. In particular, I want to call out pastors. My firmly held belief is that we are where we are because pastors withdrew their churches from the political arena. And we will only be successful if pastors re-engage in the political arena and bring their churches with them. We're called to be the watchman, the shepherd, the overseer. It's time for us to get engaged in the political process and host a public meeting, particularly at your church if you can. We need financial support. Nobody's going to be naive enough to believe that all of this can be accomplished without expenses. And at some point, I believe this will probably end up at the United States Supreme Court. We're going to need the financial support of everyone in upstate New York in order to make this a reality. And finally, tell others. The word of mouth is the best way to communicate this idea to someone else. Giving them a link to a website, showing them a video, all of those are good things. But talking to people face to face about separating from New York, when you go shopping, when you go to work, when you go play football or baseball, tell somebody about this process because it's going to take everybody in upstate New York to make this a reality. If you have any questions, you can contact me directly. I'm not ashamed to give my telephone number. My number is 716-207-7138. You can call me on my cell phone. You can send an email to me. That's my personal email. And as soon as we have the website completed and the new email address established, we'll be putting that online as well. Thank you for your time.